right, class, buckle up because we're in for a doozy. Today, we're diving into the separation of powers and our very first review of case law. What happens when a president tries to play king? History has the receipts. Separation of powers exists for a reason, so let's talk about it. The government is like a group project. Everybody has a job. Congress makes the laws, president enforces them, and the Supreme Court interprets them. If one person tries to do too much, the others step in. That's called checks and balances, and these cases prove why it matters. Marbury versus Madison, decided in 1803, tells us who's the real boss. Outgoing President John Adams was 38 hot about losing the election to Thomas Jefferson. 2 days before he was set to give up the presidency, Adams appointed a bunch of judges to the bench. His goal was to stifle power from the incoming Democratic-Republican Party. The Senate confirmed his appointments, but then Secretary of State John Marshall was unable to deliver the confirmation papers in time before Jefferson was sworn in. Because of this, Jefferson stated the commissions were void, and he told his Secretary of State, James Madison, not to deliver the papers. One of the appointed judges, William Marbury, sued. Now, collect this tea. The very same former Secretary of State who was supposed to deliver the commissions was then appointed the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Yes, Justice Marshall wrote the opinion for this case. And the Supreme Court said, sorry, Marbury, we actually don't have the power to force Madison to deliver your papers. Because, plot twist, the law that Marbury was using to sue was unconstitutional. While the court agreed that Madison should have delivered and honored the commission papers, they disagreed that the court even had the ability to force the government to commission Marbury. This is because the Judiciary Act, the law that Marbury relied on to take his case to the Supreme Court, contradicted the powers of Article 3 in the Constitution, which gave the Supreme Court power to hear only certain types of cases, and Marbury's wasn't included. Because the two were in conflict, the Supreme Court struck down the Judiciary Act as unconstitutional. And boom, judicial review was born. The power of the courts to invalidate laws that violate the Constitution. This case also established the Supreme Court as the primary interpreter of the Constitution. Without this case, the Supreme Court would just be sitting there with no real power. Imagine a referee with no whistle. This case solidified that the U.S. Constitution is actual law, not just a bunch of fancy ideals and principles that sound good. McCulloch v. Maryland, decided in 1819. Can the states check the feds? Now, let's remember that although it was the United States of America, the country was very much functioning like a whole bunch of separate countries that came together every once in a while for brunch or cocktails. The United States government created a national bank, and Maryland didn't like it. So Maryland tried to tax the bank out of existence. One of the bank's cashiers, McCulloch, refused to pay the tax, and in turn, Maryland sued McCulloch to pay the tax. The Supreme Court ruled that Congress has powers beyond what's directly written in the Constitution, like creating a national bank. If Congress has the clear power in the Constitution to lay and collect taxes, borrow money, and regulate trade, then establishing a national bank is a natural extension of those powers. Also, states can't tax or interfere with the federal operations. This case basically said the federal government isn't just strong, it's strong. It also says that Congress holds the purse, meaning Congress decides where our money goes and what it's used for. And this is something we still argue about to this day. Youngstown v. Sawyer, decided in 1952, tells us when presidents overstep their powers. During the Korean War, steel workers were going on strike, and President Truman was afraid that this would hurt the war effort. So he ordered the federal government to seize the steel mills in order to keep them running. But see, there's nowhere in the Constitution that gives the president the authority to seize private property. And with his executive order, he had overstepped congressional powers. The Supreme Court said, nope, the president isn't a king, and he can't take private property without Congress's approval. Basically, the court had to remind the president that war doesn't give him unlimited power. United States v. Nixon, decided in 1974, lets us know that no one is above the law. President Nixon was caught up in the Watergate scandal, where people in his campaign broke into Democratic offices and spied on his opponents. When investigators demanded secret White House recordings, Nixon refused to hand them over and claimed that he had executive privilege. No, neither the doctrine of separation of powers nor the generalized need for confidentiality of high-level communications without more can sustain an absolute, unqualified presidential privilege of immunity from judicial process under all circumstances. A lot of fancy words, but basically, the Supreme Court ruled against him and said executive privilege doesn't mean you get to hide evidence of a crime. Nixon handed over the tapes and just days later resigned from the office of the president. So even the president can't cover up crimes. Checks and balances for the win, right? So the next time you hear someone say the president can do whatever they want, just remember, separation of powers says otherwise until it doesn't. These cases remind us that no branch is all powerful, and that's on checks and balances. Were you here for class? Drop the scales of justice in the comments to let me know, and also let me know, how do you feel the Supreme Court's decision in Trump v. United States will change the meaning of checks and balances? If you learned something today, hit that follow button. Class is in session every week. Next time, we're diving into civil liberties and how the Reconstruction era shaped American rights. Because, spoiler alert, the fight for freedom didn't end with the Civil War.